everybody. Welcome to another episode of Structured Creativity. So, this is a monthly podcast exploring the space between process and play, hosted by me, Najma Salam, but you can call me Naj. Today, I'm joined by my friend Nicholas O'Brien, and I'm so excited because he is here to talk about game dev, being a solo game dev, if that's what you call yourself. We'll get into that. But yes, Nicholas, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Nicholas O'Brien. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to see you, Naj. I'm the founder of SA Games, which is a small game studio based in Brooklyn. It's myself and about a handful of other people that are working with me on this project specifically. In kind of like a contract basis, working on specific elements to the game. I come from actually like a fine art and a kind of contemporary art background, where I was making games in that space. But I decided about a year and a half ago to shift my kind of art practice that was primarily in like galleries and kind of fine art settings into looking more, squarely at being an industry-based studio to make like commercial products as opposed to making artistic products.
Wow, amazing. So that's an incredible bit of history there already, but could you talk a little bit more about what triggered that change, I guess? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was actually something very specific. The previous game that I worked on, or the last game I should say, that I released was a game called The Last Survey, which is an experimental visual novel that's all hand-drawn with graphite, pencil, or I should say charcoal, pencil, and digital drawings, frame-by-frame animation. And I made that project, and I got into this very lucky position where a publisher asked me if I was interested in porting the game to the Nintendo Switch. And I was like, that sounds really cool. That sounds really interesting. I've never thought that would be something that I would want to do with my artistic practice. But I said, sure. I kind of I checked it out. I made sure it wasn't a scam. It was a very good working relationship with this organization, this publisher called Red Deer Games. And they ported the game to Nintendo Switch. And I got this big surge of a new audience that I didn't think that I would ever have access to. A big international audience, I should say, too. And people seemed to really deeply respond to the content that was in that and really actually play the thing, like really play it, read it, experience it, have arguments with it, have discussions with it. And that's really what I wanted out of the experience of making games. And so I said to myself, I felt that I wasn't getting that same level of investment in a kind of fine art audience. That's not a knock against it. It's just like a different type of engagement. And so I was like, well, if I want to be continuing to make games that are, things that are going to have close reads or going to continue conversations or spark interesting, hopeful discourse around the subject matter of the game, maybe I want to do this in an industry setting and continue to go down this route as opposed to think about developing something, just for a gallery-based audience.
Totally. Yeah. Wow. That's really incredible. And I guess even before that, like, was this something that you envisioned yourself doing your whole life? Like, did you grow up thinking that you would be making games?
No, I didn't. I actually kind of like fancied myself as like a filmmaker.
Oh, wow.
That was like definitely something in my like teenage years. I don't know, maybe I'm like of a certain vintage at this point where like when I was in high school, there was like a glut of affordable handheld mini DV camcorders.
Oh, yes.
And so like this was like a big thing. And so, me and a friend of mine, got one of these together and was able to, get a FireWire connection and a computer, a pretty bare bones computer to do some video editing on Vegas video editor, which I think now is owned by Sony. So we like had this very like ad hoc thing, and we were really interested. We were watching a ton of film. I was watching a ton of film, so I went to school. I went to art school thinking, I was going to be doing video and film making, and I did do that a lot actually while I was there.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the tail end, I started kind of thinking about interactive media more, thinking about how to turn my practice into things that were being distributed online. They
Mm-hmm.
weren't just like in a proscenium setting.
Mm.
So that like was kind of the shift. But no, it was I didn't like I had always grown up playing games, but it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
something that I was like, I want to be a game developer. I want to do this. It was more for me, it was more
Yeah.
like I was growing up seeing a lot of cinema and I was like, oh, I want to make something like that. So I feel like now that's like change that like people are no longer interested in making films in that same way and they're like I want to be a game developer.
Yeah.
So maybe I was like on that cusp of like the last gen that was like still wanting to be a filmmaker. I'm sure I'm exaggerating, but yeah.
No, I feel like we're from the same stock there, because I definitely remember those little things that you slot your hand in and the little thing that comes out. The little screen that comes out, and the quality is not the best because it's still digital. And it's yeah and it's yeah so yeah, I remember having a lot of fun times seeing that growing up as well. So okay, so I'm starting to see this sort of feed into your love of visual storytelling, and that kind of cinematic flavor to your works as well. Would you say that's like a big part of like the things that you do?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I mean, yeah, you like hit the nail on the head, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think when we use like, or when I hear that term like cinematic, right? When it's in relation to games, like sometimes we get stuck in this conversation about like cutscenes or vistas and
Oh,
graphics and
sure.
stuff.
Sweeping. Yeah.
Yeah, these like
Yeah.
very kind of like picturesque things and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And although that stuff can be really fun and engaging and
Mm-hmm.
definitely something that I marvel at. Uh yeah, it was more about this like the kind of delicate storytelling that you can do over the course
Yeah.
of a film, and how you can kind of broach subject matter, or content or things that are happening in kind of contemporary society in a like very
Mm-hmm.
kind of nuanced and like even sometimes slow and like very methodical way. And so
Oh,
yeah, that
totally.
the name of essay games comes from my love for essay films, which I think now has
Mm.
a very different connotation than when I grew up or when I was like
Mm-hmm.
becoming an artist. I think now when people think of essay films, they think of like, um, I don't know, someone like Jacob Geller or something that's like
Oh,
making these YouTube essay, right?
sure.
Like, which
Yeah.
are great, which are fantastic. Like, they're
Yeah.
really, amazing.
Uh,
But for me, that was like looking at filmmakers and artists like Haroon Faroki, or Chantal Ackerman,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
or Trin Min Ha. These artists that were like
Mm.
thinking about how to use cinema. Chris Burton is like, or not Chris Burton. Gosh, why can't I think of his name now? Not Chris Burton. He's a different artist. But anyways, these filmmakers, right? These artists that were making films that were kind of about subject matter, but they were also told through this very personalized lens, like an essayist
Mm.
would.
Yeah.
So that was like that's the origins of thinking about essay games, was like how to create games that are borrowing from those motifs and borrowing from those storytelling techniques, but adapting them into an interactive story. Yeah.
That's a great origin story. Wow, amazing. So yeah, I didn't think I'd asked where essay games come from. So that's really cool to know. Would you say that there were films, or maybe like a group of films that really triggered that were kind of like the seed that inspired you to become, to pursue your artistic practice? And then the same for games as well, when you
Mm.
started making that change?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. I would definitely say the artist that I was thinking about before was Chris Marker, not Chris
Mm-hmm.
Burton. But I remember when I first saw his film Sans Soleil,
Mm-hmm.
in college in art school. I was like it was very impactful for me.
Mm-hmm.
The way that it kind of weaves materiality, storytelling, like fiction, the way in which it kind of exposes the ways in which we lie using using a
Oh.
camera, or the ways in which we can kind of bend the truth around a particular perspective or lens, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, but that was like kind of early on in the process. So that wasn't like, it's like, oh, aha, now I want to make games.
Yeah,
But
sure, sure.
but that was certainly one.
Yeah.
It's interesting because like I think like when I was a kid, I was like exposed to stuff that was like everything from, I'm trying to think of like non-cliched versions of this, but like the Seventh Seal, or
Oh yeah, of
like
course.
Fellini films, or
Wow.
these kind of like art
Yeah.
house cinema stuff, or even stuff that was
Incredible.
like even a little bit more further afield,
Mm-hmm.
and really wanting to dig into that. Fassbinder's films and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
These films that were like kind of, they were definitely pieces of cinema and not like pieces of movies. But I was exposed to stuff like that at the same time that I was like being exposed, or not being exposed, but I was like watching things like The Matrix, right? It was like, so
Yeah,
it was
sure,
this like
sure.
this interesting dynamic where like I was equally as influenced by something that was like very small and nuanced and
Mm-hmm.
very intimate, and then something that was like really, like a huge blockbuster film.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. But
so
incredibly deep though. Incredibly
yeah,
deep.
yeah,
Yeah.
like very, very like, when you
Mm-hmm.
get into the weeds, yeah, the
Mm-hmm.
Wachowskis, they definitely like, were thinking
Mm-hmm.
about a lot of stuff in that film, and
Definitely.
wanting to present it in a very kind of digestible and like entertaining way.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
but yeah, in terms of games, I think that things for me really started taking a turn when I was living in Chicago at the time, and was really close with the folks, and still I'm pretty close with one of the developers of Kentucky Route Zero. And I remember when Act One was released of that, and I was just
Mm,
so blown away and so inspired by what they were doing with storytelling, what they were doing
yeah.
with scenery and setting and tone. It felt, really cinematic to me.
Mm-hmm.
Even the moments of slowness that happen in Act One. There's
Yeah.
a moment in Act One where you're going through this collapsed mine, and there's a long section in which you are riding this very slow cart through the space, and sometimes in darkness and sometimes in not. And it's such
Mm.
a slow, contemplative, uh, ominous, like kind of truly exposition based moment in
Mm,
the
mm-hmm.
game, and I hadn't
Yeah.
really seen anything like that previously. And so that was like a real revelation for me, to
Yeah.
think that like games, not like that they could do this, because I knew that they could, but to see it executed at that level, right,
Oh, totally.
that was like really inspiring to me.
Yeah. And I do think there must be a group of people that would absolutely hate that, right? Like because, if not given to the right audience who also don't understand like the context behind, that kind of storytelling. I imagine they'd be like, what the hell is this? But yeah,
I
yeah.
think what they did really
Yeah.
well, I totally
Yeah.
agree, Nash.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
but I think what they did really well is that even if people hated it, they understood
Mhm.
it. And I think that
Yes.
that's like a really fine line, right? I think
Absolutely.
like making, or not making, but like presenting a game's tone and presenting a game's intention is so
Hmm.
much about the design process, so that even if that part feels really grueling as a player, or really
Hmm.
like quote unquote boring as an experience, it's like it's not veering from its intention, right? It's
Hmm.
like
Hmm.
hitting you right where it's supposed to be hitting you. So
Yeah.
what I loved about even just in Act One, and it happens in a lot of places over the 5 acts of that game,
Hmm.
where like, yeah, even if you're like, this is not for me, like this is not the game I signed up for, or this is not something I want to play, you
Yeah.
still in the back of your mind are like, but I know why this is being made. I
Mm.
understand like what the intention is behind having this moment, and I think that that's
Yeah.
extremely powerful.
Yeah, understanding intention is such an important part of appreciating any kind of art, any kind of medium for sure. So I think when I always really enjoy it when I can really almost feel the artist or the team reaching out and telling me their intention
Absolutely.
through the game or through the movie or whatever it may be. So yeah, that's really incredible. Yeah, wow. So what a cool journey from here to where you are now with SK Games. And so this makes me think, this is just an inkling. This makes me think you think a lot about creativity.
Yeah.
And quite deeply. So what do you think creativity looks like? Yeah.
I think creativity looks like research. To me, a lot of
Oh,
what
amazing.
essay games is about is like knowing your material, right?
Yeah.
Like doing your homework, for lack of a better term. But like really, getting into the weeds, right? Like figuring out the way that how something works or how something exists, or people's thoughts and opinions about the subject matter that aren't just your own, but are like going out and either seeking experts and talking to them about like what that field is about or what the subject matter is about, or talking to just other individuals that have personal experience about maybe something that you're working on, to delve into the material and broaden kind of the aperture, or broaden the kind of headspace that you might be bringing to a project. So for me, creativity really looks like doing that research, right? Compiling resources, compiling thoughts, compiling ideas, compiling stories, and then figuring out how to weave that information and weave that research into a playable experience, playing, or for me at least, but any kind of experience, right? Any kind of mode of expression. For me, creativity like really looks like getting into the weeds. Like I used to say all the time, like I love getting on the horn, which is like to me an old man phrase, but it's like you get on the phone, like you pick up the phone and you call someone about the thing that you're working on.
Gotcha.
And like talk to somebody at length about what that thing is and what your interest is. And by doing that, I think also discovering what your interest actually is in that content. Research does this really fantastic thing for me in the creative process, where it actually allows me to take a very broad idea and start to funnel it down or winnow it down into a specific thought or a specific tone or a specific outcome, right? It's like, okay, I have this idea about X, but what I want X to do is like have this specific moment, this aha moment, or this this kind of epiphany on the part of the player to like experience the thing that you're intending.
Yeah. That is so similar. It's slightly different take, but it's so similar to how I think about creativity, which is connecting disparate points together, points that normally wouldn't kind of sit next to each other, be connected to each other. But in order to do that, you have to broaden your horizons and gather as many of those points as possible. So I think about it like data points. That's really incredible. Research. I always think about the thing that I love to say is make normal weird or make weird normal. And that's what a lot of creativity can look like as well, because you can really only do that by, again, broadening your horizons or getting on the horn. I love that as well. Could you tell me a little bit about what that looked like for your experience of working on your games? Like how did that look like? Was it the same process? Did it look slightly different?
Yeah, that's it. It does look different from project to project. So, for instance, for the last survey of the game that I referenced before, a lot of that had to do with reading primary source material. So that game is about a kind of speculative, not so distant future in which the world's rare earth mineral supplies are rapidly growing out. And for anybody that might not know, these things are like the metals that we put in our phones and our laptops and in green technology. And there is a finite amount of, cobalt and nickel and silver and stuff like on the planet, but, we're not anywhere near that threshold. But it was kind of talking about supply chain, right? And on one's own culpability within a system, and that's extracting this stuff from the earth, right? And what being kind of a person that's very aware of that process feels like, and trying to understand like one's place within a larger system of power and commerce and so on and so forth. So a lot of that was like reading quarterly reports from like global mining companies, like seeing like, okay, where is their base of operations? What do those base of operations look like? What's the production yield of those base of operations? What's the metallurgic process that this, company is going through to like, create an alloy that's efficient for this thing? It's like, okay, we're talking about green technology. What type of green technology? What's the metal in that? So it's like so it's really trying to like, so for that project, that was a lot of like, more like primary scientific research than it was
Yeah.
like necessary, and like talking to people that were either working in advocacy roles within protecting land that against kind of this extractive mining process,
Mm.
um, to talk about like, okay, well, what would it look like if for some reason this mine uh, uh, overnight stopped yielding its vein,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What would that look like? What would it do to the local population? What would happen to the site, right? All of these different questions.
Mm-hmm.
So that for that project, that was a combination of like, yeah, looking at primary resources and then like talking to people that were working in the field.
Mm-hmm.
But for a previous project called the Trolley, um, that was like more of this kind of get on the horn thing where I was like calling historical societies to like get images from these things so that I can make 3D models from them.
Oh my
Talk
gosh.
about this actually gathering stories, firsthand stories and experiences of closures of public transportation systems in the country. So
Yeah.
that was a lot more just like actual conversations and interviews. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it can kind of vary depending on projects.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
Wow. And would you like to talk about your current project? Was there that level of, because it's a slightly different subject matter, so I'm really curious to hear what that looked like for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Yeah. I was like trying to resist. I was like, how does this fit with what I'm working on now? But yeah, so the project that I'm working on now is called Bundle of Joy, and it's a dad simulator in the style of WarioWare. So it's a series of mini games that have these narrative vignettes interspersed to kind of share the experience that I personally went through of becoming a
Mm-hmm.
parent during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so the research part of that is way
Yeah.
more, trying to like plumb my own feelings about that thing and
Yeah.
talking to
Yeah.
other parents that also experience similar things,
Mm.
but also polling parents that are also older, or like maybe a half generation older than me, to be like, what was the thing when you were like taking care of your infant that like really irked you, or what would be a mini game of something that you particularly had to do a lot. So, for
Yeah.
instance, like in my mini game, or sorry, in my personal experience, one thing that we had to do a lot with our infant child was to give them nebulizer treatments for
Mm.
kind of pre-asthmatic, uh, uh, issues, right, medical issues.
Mm-hmm.
And but I talking to other parents, there's a lot of other parents that didn't have to do any of that nebulizer treatment, and that was like really hard for me to like wrap my head around. So in the same
Ah.
way, I talked to a couple of parents who were like, oh well, we had to get a lot of like these like shots early on to like contest these things and do a lot of like other medical stuff that was really stressful for us. And it's like, oh, okay, so like
Wow.
that's like another important element here. So yeah, so trying to
Yeah.
like, yeah, it's kind of in a weird way similar to the trolley, and where I'm talking to people kind of one-on-one.
Getting on the horn. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
totally. But also kind
Yeah.
of being a bit more scattershot, like going into
Mm.
parenting spaces or parenting forums and being like, hey, I'm designing this thing. What's the thing that like would really like send you, right? Like what would
Yeah.
be the mini game that would like re-trigger the trauma that you went through in that like 0 to 6 months?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more scattershot, and more
Yeah.
open-ended and more based on volunteer as opposed to like looking
Mm.
at specific expertise.
Mm-hmm. But still, I mean that is expertise. It's very personal, very emotional, and I imagine you got some really evocative answers from that as well. It's like, what is the thing that annoyed you? And I'm sure people were like, "Oh my god!"
Yeah, it was funny. I had this great moment where I was asking my Discord, because there's some parents in the Discord that I run for Essay Games, and there was
Yeah.
a parent that was like, "Oh, we had to do so much nose plunging, and it really bothered me." And I had this moment where I was like, "Oh yeah, that totally sucked," and I was like, oh my God, like, yes, that should be a game, because I remember that so intimately, of it being such a struggle.
Oh,
So yeah, so stuff like that is like very,
yeah.
it's been really fun kind of uh, creating spaces for like mutual catharsis, right? Because like
Yeah.
now you can kind of
Yeah.
talk about it and laugh, or kind of like feel like, you have enough distance from the thing to not have it be triggering, but like,
Yeah.
yeah, there's been a lot of kind of like great moments like that in the research
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, I mean that, again, it's all research, it's all creative input that you've funneled into your through your filters, I guess, as well, to make the thing that you uniquely you can make. And I think that's the thing that is so interesting and so lovely about any sort of creative practice, because even though, say, two people might make a game about the exact same subject matter,
Mm.
because their filters are different, their life experiences are different, it's going to look like two completely different things. And so yeah, it's really wonderful to see, how your game comes out, because it shows you a lot about who you are as a person as well, and the team behind you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that for people that are like used to my previous projects, I think that folks are kind of like, wow, this is like a real departure, right? This is like you were making these games that were about these like, cultural issues that were,
Mm-hmm.
maybe historical or maybe speculative, right? And like,
Mm-hmm.
creating a
Yeah.
critical lens around those things. But this feels like way more close to home. And I'm like, yeah, but that's like still essayistic, right? When we
Mm-hmm.
talk about the essay,
Absolutely.
one of like the most popular essays is like the personal essay, right? And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that those filmmakers that I referenced before, they always kind of put, or not always, but a lot of times they would put themselves kind of squarely as this kind of central focus of thinking about, the critical content of whatever subject
Mm-hmm.
matter that they're dealing with. So
Mm-hmm.
in my kind of like my defense or whatever, or like my argument is like, yeah, it's like different, it's way different content, but the approach is somewhat similar in that like
Mm-hmm.
I'm still wanting to kind of create spaces to be contemplative, spaces to be thoughtful, spaces to question
Mm-hmm.
the experience and the content of the experience. But this time, yeah, it's way more close to home. It's way more based on my own personal experience with the subject matter, as opposed
Yeah.
to looking at it maybe from a little bit of a distance.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's going to be a really interesting experience for people who are not parents,
Absolutely.
to play through the game and feel what you are, putting across as well, because again, it's very evocative what you're making. So, yeah, wow.
Yeah, that's the hope. The hope is that
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
really designed for parents and non-parents, and for people
Mm-hmm.
that are completely uninterested in being a parent or taking on that role.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because I think that what I found in the experience of becoming a parent is that all of a sudden I started questioning all these other aspects of my creativity, right?
Wow.
Who I was, my
Mm.
identity, and I think that those questions and those, that introspective thinking that was like so important and so
Mm-hmm.
like pervasive in becoming a
Yeah.
parent. I think that
Yeah.
that's relevant, and I think that people go through many different types of phases in which they're questioning their roles and questioning their identity given the circumstances of their lives or the choices that they've made.
Yeah, totally. And I find that every time I'm experiencing some media which is about parenthood, even though I'm not a parent myself, I think a lot about my own parents and their
Mm.
relation to me and my relationship to them, and it makes me think a lot about, oh wow, they did their best in this particular situation, and it's always a really interesting discussion with myself to have whenever I'm confronted with that type of that media, so that subject matter, at least. So that's really interesting.
Mm.
Well, actually, so so we've talked a lot about research, and we've talked a lot about funneling that through your creative filters, as it were. What would you say are your favorite tools in the process, and maybe in game dev, just in general?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'm a huge advocate of Godot. I'm making Bundle of
Mm.
Joy in Godot,
Mm-hmm.
and for anyone that doesn't know what Godot is, it's an open source game engine that its architecture is quite unique in that it's really based on compartmentalizing kind of tasks or behaviors or
Mm-hmm.
things that you want to have in the game into
Mm-hmm.
very kind of discrete, nodes within the
Mm-hmm.
system.
Mm-hmm.
And then the process of making a game is kind of like bringing all those nodes together, or populating a scene with all of these kind of discrete parts and having them interact with one another.
Yeah.
And so I find that to be like really great as like a, solo developer, as like a small team,
Mm-hmm.
because it allows me to like kind of focus really intently on one specific uh, mechanic or one specific behavior or one specific, thing. And it
Mm-hmm.
allows to like break down something really complex like a game or, an interactive experience into these like really small parts.
Mm-hmm.
So then it kind of like allows me to like kind of, it keeps me going, right? Like I
Mm-hmm.
get a small part done and I'm like, okay, next small part. And like
Oh
as a
yes.
solo developer, that's like super important to me to like maintain that kind of momentum and maintain that development.
Uh,
So yeah, Godot is like a huge tool that I use.
mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, a couple of other tools that come to mind. Blender is also like a huge tool that I use.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, like you can maybe say that like my game development journey started kind of through Blender to a certain
Oh.
extent.
Mm-hmm.
When I was like kind of shifting gears between being like a filmmaker and veering into games, I kind of did that through teaching myself 3D modeling and animation. And the way that I did that was
Ah.
by learning Blender. And so, yeah, so I still am actively using Blender, and like I'm a huge fan of the user base and the tools, and to see it grow and to become such a kind of powerful force within
Mm-hmm.
like VFX and 3D modeling and animation industries is just like really heartwarming.
Mm-hmm.
I find it to be like an incredibly versatile and very high functioning tool. And it's open source, which is also great, and it's free, which is also great. And then the last tool that I use and that I'm using in Bundle of Joy is Inky, which is the kind of
Mm-hmm.
scripting IDE, if you will, scripting and writing tool for using Ink, the kind of
Oh.
interactive branching narrative language that Inkle Studios developed and uses in their projects. I just find it to be an awesome tool. It's very handy for creating both complex and easily wieldable interactive stories.
Mm-hmm.
In Bundle of Joy, I'm using it kind of possibly not to its full potential. Like
Okay.
I'm using it quite like linearly, though there are
Uh,
like kind of moments in which you can have these branching narratives in these narrative vignettes that happen within the game.
mm-hmm.
It's not this like heavy variable base thing where it's like, oh, did you visit this branch? And if you visited that branch, then it unlocks this other thing.
Yeah, sure.
So
Yeah.
it's a little bit more kind of straightforward for that. But what I love about Inky and Ink based projects is that they're very portable to other engines. So you can port Ink to Unity, to Godot, to Unreal,
Wow.
to a lot of different platforms, or you can run it just in the browser itself. So I find it to just be a very powerful tool, and so much so that I've like tried to contribute some stuff to the people that are working on the Ink plugin for Godot, and doing like active documentation and tutorials to show how to use the tool
Wow.
and plug it into the software. So yeah, so like yeah, a love letter to a certain extent to both Godot and Ink. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So totally open source. It sounds like. And I think in the same growth that Blender has seen, Godot has seen a growth in recent years as well, especially with a lot of people jumping over from Unity to Godot.
Mhm.
How's that been like for you? Just because you've been working Godot's like that whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, well, it's funny. I feel like I tell this story when I finished the last survey, and I had built that game very much how I would build a game in Godot, but it was
Mm-hmm.
much more difficult to do that for me, at least in Unity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so when then I got done with that game, and it was out there, it was like doing its thing.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I'm ready to work on the next project. And at that time, I kind of had this idea for this other project that I was thinking about. And I opened up Unity, and I just like looked at the screen, and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. I just like had this moment of being like, I don't want to get started on this. And I was like, okay, I have
Yeah.
this really great opportunity right now to think about developing or to think about working in a new tool, something that
Mm.
maybe I'm a little bit more aligned with, maybe is more aligned with the way that I want to develop a project.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so that was like in 2020, 2000, yeah, 2020. And yeah, it was like also during the pandemic, so I like had a little bit more
Yeah.
like time to like sit in front of a computer, I guess. um
Yeah.
so yeah, so that was like it's been interesting now to see like more recently that there's been a surge in the user base, right? There's been a huge
Mm.
influx of people coming to the tool, which has been both really exciting and then I think also really kind of like daunting.
Yeah.
I read this article recently, I think it was in Game Developer, that was about how the developers of Godot were really worried about the surge. They were like hoping that the surge wouldn't impact them too much,
Oh,
or they were like
interesting.
nervous about that transition. It was like really, it's an interesting read. Um, but yeah, I think like it's been interesting to be an individual developing in the software and seeing a lot more people coming to it and seeing it gain so much more momentum and seeing
Mm.
even bigger studios starting to use it as their engine, that whether it's
Mm.
like the people that make Slay the Spire or Second Dinner,
Yeah.
these like studios that are out there that are like, you know what, we're going to start supporting this engine, working in this engine, and thinking about, supporting it long term.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's I find it's really wonderful. Like it's one of the best parts of the internet, I think, where you have these sort of open source projects that
Mm.
you have an amazing creative community behind it who actively want to grow it and make it the best tool it can be to help other creatives and make more things as well. So it's just a really wonderful virtuous cycle. I guess. But yeah, so you've got those three tools, and I guess in terms of like tools with regards to other elements of your process as well, your creative process. Do you have favorite tools for conducting research or anything like that?
Yeah, I think it like
No.
kind of goes project to project.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also like a big pen and paper kind of guy. Like I
Mm.
I really like having research based notebooks. So I
Yeah.
like had a notebook for the trolley. I had a notebook for the last survey. I have a notebook now
Ah.
that I'm actually
Yeah.
about to fill for Bundle of Joy,
Oh
and
my
those
gosh.
can be
Yeah.
everything from like actual notes, like actual research based notes to like design ideas and sketches of design ideas before, I
Mm-hmm.
actually go into software, or to
Yeah.
think about like what the point of interactivity might be in an experience. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I do a lot of like pen and paper based stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I am like fantastically not great at like doing project management and organization. So,
What?
so like, all right, I think that I'm not. I think like I have a
Yeah.
system.
Oh yeah. Sure.
So I really like using Notion just like for very bare bones stuff. Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm a list maker. So like having
Mm-hmm.
Notion that just like has a lot of like check boxes that I can just be like done, 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 done,
Oh
done. Oh, that's
yes.
satisfying, and then like getting rid of that and then adding to that list again and then going through it and kind of cycling through that. So that's definitely like a tool that I've been using a lot more recently,
Mm-hmm.
even for kind of like sketching and storing research too. I definitely have
Mm-hmm.
like a Notion board, if you will, that's like
Mm-hmm.
for specifically for visual references. And then I have another kind of like Notion page that's specifically for technical references. So to be
Oh,
like, oh,
very
okay, I'm
cool.
using this thing. I should probably like reference this thing at some point later if I need to come back to it. Or at the end of it, I should probably like, thank this person and like make sure that they know
Yeah.
that I like, I looked at this resource in order to do the thing that I needed to do.
Wow, incredible. Yeah, I mean that's like thinking in nodes as well. So I'm seeing a little pattern here.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. Yeah, I think the pen and paper bit is very important as part of the process, and it's interesting when you said that. So me and some friends from a smaller studio, we've been doing this thing where we've been watching episodes of the Double Fine documentary all about their making of Broken Age, and
Yeah.
Tim Schafer fills up notebooks for each game that he makes, which is yeah, that seems like a very game dev thing.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
kind of a practice that I like started getting into
Mm.
like really early on in the
Mhm.
process. It was just something that felt so I don't know. I think sometimes I like can get quite lost in my files, right? Like,
Sure.
and especially because like the quickening in which like sometimes machines like all, like a machine or a hard drive or whatever, like kind of, like I'm on like a new computer for Bundle of Joy and I don't have my like reference material for my like other stuff. And so like
Yeah.
to a certain extent, I'm like, you know what? I just need to have something physical and tactile that I can
Mm,
pull up and like reference right away.
yeah.
So yeah, that was like, yeah, I've always kind of like kept a notebook in that way. And it's also something too where I'm like, sometimes I'll be somewhere where I know that I like can't access my computer, but I'll still have my notebook and I'll be like,
Oh, for
oh,
sure.
I just like had a great idea for this design thing. I need to like make sure that I write this down.
I need to scribble it down. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
everywhere I go, I'm always carrying my very stickered up notebook with me as well. So yeah, totally relate with that. So what would you say is some really underrated skills for game devs to have?
Yeah, some underrated skills. I would say like a really big underrated skill. There's two that jump to mind. One is communication. I think that
Mm-hmm.
communication is really important as a game developer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because not only is it important, it's like it seems so obvious, right? It's like, well, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you can, yeah, like of course, like if you're running a team, like you got to talk to people. But I used to run this or not run, but I used to teach this summer program of teaching game design for high school students, and
Oh,
we would do
okay.
this thing about at the end of the session, we would do this thing where we would go look at existing game dev jobs, like on
Mm-hmm.
different job sites or whatever, and I would just like go through and like list things or just like highlight things that are like skills and things that you're like looking for, and it's
Mm-hmm.
usually the order goes something like experience, right? Is like the first or something like that. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
the second is like technical knowledge, or maybe those are together. And then the
Yeah.
third is like high level of communication skills, like able to work with
Yeah.
others, has been able to work on a team in a successful manner. And I'm
Yeah.
like, they're not putting that there just for fun, right? They're not putting that there to just like fill out the bullet list. Like that's a
Yeah.
huge asset to be able to have. Like if you can clearly communicate your ideas and clearly receive right ideas and feedback from
Mm,
other people,
yeah.
that becomes a huge asset in the development process. Because like you said, right, so much of the design process and the development process is about intention, right? And
Yeah.
if you can't communicate what that intention is even to yourself, then you
Mm,
get lost, right? Then like
yeah.
you end up making something that doesn't have that like hook, right? Doesn't have that like central pull. um,
Absolutely.
so yeah, so I think that that's like a really important skill to have.
Mm.
The other important skill that that I think is important is understanding your own limitations.
Oh,
Um,
yes.
so
Yes.
something that I kind of came to grips with in developing the Bundle of Joy is that
Mm-hmm.
I knew that Bundle of Joy. I knew that I wanted it to have this very specific look. I wanted it to
Mm-hmm.
have like almost like a childlike scribble outside of the lines, this like not quite
Mm-hmm.
hand drawn, but this like blend between 3D and 2D elements. And I wanted these to kind of overlap in this kind of very unique way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, okay, I'm going to like get into learning, shader code to do this. And I did that for like a day. And then I
Yeah.
was like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
So instead, I was like, I know that if I sat here and I whatever studied this and researched this for like
Yeah.
3 months, maybe I would
Yeah.
get to a little bit of where I want to be.
Yeah.
But why don't I reach out to someone that's a proper technical artist to like work on this instead?
Props to you.
And it was the best decision that I ever made. And
Yeah.
Fabian, who's working on the project as a technical artist and also kind of a Godot generalist for the project, it has been incredible to work with. And within the first day, came back with like a visual prototype of the thing that I was like thinking about. And I was like,
Wow.
this would have taken me forever. Like I just saved so much time, and it's so much, and also like the feedback and the communication between us has been amazing. He's been awesome to work with. So yeah, so I think like understanding your limits, knowing like you don't have to do everything yourself. You
Totally.
can find outlets, you can find collaborators, you can find people that have strengths and skills to offset things that
Mm,
you either don't have the development time for, the research and development time for, or
yeah.
like just don't have the like knack for.
Yeah.
And I think like knowing that is a super, super important skill.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wow. That's such a big one. It's something I definitely don't hear people talk about a lot, but yeah, I think if for me personally, if I really wanted to, I could sit down and I could figure out anything. But how much time and money do I do I have to be
Hmm.
able to do that?
Yeah.
I still have commitments to tend to. I still have rent to pay, this and that, and you just think, actually, let's just get an expert, someone who has spent their like committed a large chunk of their life to being really good at this one thing,
Hmm.
and work together with them. So that's also really important. But also that kind of ties into the communication piece as well, because the thing that again, I feel like what people don't talk a lot about in communication is like it's often like, oh, communication with other people, but there's also this piece about communication with yourself, checking in with
Hmm.
yourself. Like, what is the thing you're trying to make? What are you trying to achieve with this thing you're trying to make? Like, what are your own personal goals as well that coming out on the other end of this project too? So, and is it to like tear your hair out trying to figure out this one one thing, or is it to make something good?
Yeah, totally. I had this great advice early on in starting the studio, where I was talking to someone that works as an advisor and works in the industry,
Mm-hmm.
and has started and sold a company, and like someone that's like very well established and like has
Mm-hmm.
done a lot of the kind of like big wig stuff within the industry.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
and I was talking to them about like starting the studio and thinking about what it was that I wanted to do and so on and so forth. And he, very early on in the process, he was like, okay, so two questions. He was like, one, what's the biggest thing in game development or in making a game, not in development, but in making a
Mm-hmm.
game that you struggle with? Like, what's the thing that you really don't like doing? And he said, and then two, what's the end goal of what you want to make? Like, what's the end purpose of
Mm-hmm.
what you want to make, and how what are the hurdles in place for you to like make that thing, right? Like, what are the
Yeah.
things that you think that you don't currently have that you would need in order to like get to that point?
Yeah.
And I think asking those two questions to yourself, like you said,
Mm-hmm.
communicating those two questions to yourself and really like answering those honestly and like without ego, right? And
Mm-hmm.
just like
Yeah.
super, super clearly helps structure then a path towards achieving that end goal, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think this to bring it back to communication as well, I'm finding that um it's a lot about being able to actively listen to someone,
Mm,
and translate that information, and then be able to translate that information into tasks. Actually, there's a lot happening there. There's so many steps there where it can go wrong, and I think that's what actually people mean by good communication, because it's not just the articulation of whatever it is you want to do and what needs to happen, but it's also being able to take stuff in, and again, as an individual, being able to take your present situation in, and being like, I realistically can't learn how to program. Well, I'm talking about myself. I realistically can't learn how to program, but
right.
I can. But I do know a lot of talented programmers, and we can definitely collaborate on this thing.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think also,
Mm,
something along those lines too is I've always admired individuals that are never afraid of asking questions.
oh,
Um,
for sure. Yeah.
there's when I was kind of more in like a fine art setting, there was this person that I was, used to be close friends with, that as a they're considered an expert in their field. They're considered someone that's like very well established, have worked with a ton of people, very,
Mm-hmm.
very knowledgeable, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what I always admired about them is that they were never hesitant to ask questions. They were never
Mm,
hesitant to say, to say, no, I don't know what that is. Can you explain that to me? Or to kind of bring someone into the conversation, or to bring themselves into, a discourse or whatever in a way that was like super informed and not
Yeah.
just like kind of like smiling and nodding. You know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think that that's something that I've had to like um, learn and relearn a lot in the development process of knowing, of like reminding myself like it's okay to ask questions, it's okay not to know everything, it's okay
Yeah.
to understand your limitations, like I said, but
Mm,
it's also okay to then like allow someone else to like bring their knowledge, bring their presence
mm,
into what you want to be making. um, Another thing
yeah.
that you said too that I think is so important in the creative process is like
Yeah.
knowing how to filter feedback
Mm,
too. I think
yeah.
as developers and designers, so much of the time you get feedback that I have this experience at least where I'm like, oh, I really don't want to remake this. Like someone gives you feedback and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
but that would mean I would have to like refactor this whole thing or redesign
Sure.
this. And like, I really don't want to do that. And I
Yeah.
think that the urge as a designer is to then make excuses for yourself to not fully take that feedback. But I think
Yeah.
that what's necessary to do, or part of that communication element, is to really earnestly take that feedback and like to, again, set your ego aside and be like, you know what, this feedback is helping me try to reach this goal. And as a result, I
Yeah.
need to really think about how I can incorporate it.
Yeah. Yeah. I was speaking to a friend um the other day, and we were talking about feedback as well, and you kind of have to take feedback as a gift because it means that
Mhm.
people cared enough to tell you about the game and truly want to see something to make it better, even if it's not as informed, or they're really coming without some whatever context that you would like them to have. But yeah, absolutely, I think filtering the feedback is really important, especially, and I imagine being the creator at the center of coordinating various people to do this work with you. You're going to take the feedback more personally than other people as well, right? Because you're at the core of this thing. But
Mm,
yeah, I do think
mm,
it's very important to think about, well, actually, what are they trying to say with this feedback too?
mhm,
That's a really important thing as well. So we've talked about creativity, we've talked about process with the tools and underrated skills. So let's talk about that space between creativity and structure and process. So yeah, how are you balancing the, I guess, like the what people would call like the hard skills, like the technical elements, but also balancing that with the more, I guess, the esoteric stuff as well, like translating the experience of being a parent, for example. What would you say are like some of the most like juicy or most interesting parts of like combining these two things together?
yeah, I would. That's like a big question.
Yeah.
I would say that like some of the juiciest moments
Mm,
of like translating those hard skills. Well,
mm,
I'm going to borrow from somebody else actually, because I think that they almost articulated it better than I did.
mm,
I went to a talk last year from this designer, this game designer, Cosmo D.
mm,
He's made a bunch of really interesting and great games, but he made some, for my money, one of the best games. I think was it 2023, like last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago. Geez, that
mm.
was called is called Betrayal at Club Low. Maybe it was 2022. Anyways, it's a really interesting game. It's totally in his aesthetic. It's borrows so much from tabletop role playing, and the
Mm,
conceit of it is like very simple and very like clean and concise.
mm,
I think it's an exceptional design like product in a
yeah,
certain sense, though I
yeah.
think that he would maybe cringe at me calling it that, but I find that it's like really, its game loop is very clear, it's like just really really well executed.
Mm,
But he was talking about the development of that project and talking about the rounds of play testing that he did as he was kind of trying to synthesize the hard skills of designing the tabletop dice rolling that happened in that game
yeah.
with the soft kind of skills of the experience that he wanted people to have. And he
Mm-hmm.
said that he realized that he had gotten to that point, that he had nailed that, space right between those two,
Mm-hmm.
when he was watching somebody play test it with a couple of other friends, and they did a roll and they all cheered when they got the result that they wanted. He
Okay.
heard a verbal like, yeah, and he said like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm onto something here, right?
Yeah.
And part of that is like the design intention of what he's making,
Mm.
but
Mm.
also part of it is like this kind of frictionless that happens where when you get the result that you're looking for. So I think like in that way, the kind of like juicy moments are like
Mm.
watching other people play the game and
Yeah.
like getting it, right? Getting the tone, getting the, even if there's like they experience a bug, or even if they're like, oh, this thing didn't quite work for me, or
Mm.
recommending something that like maybe is very particular about their own unique experience.
Yeah.
um, they like fundamentally are like, I understand what you're
Mm.
going for, or like
Mm.
I get that, or like yes,
Mm.
like head nodding along with the experience
Mm.
that you're like crafting.
Yeah.
um, as an example, I had this amazing experience of showing the game at Play NYC a couple weeks
Mm.
ago, and I had somebody come and play the game that is works in childcare and in early
Mm.
childcare.
Okay. Yeah.
And so they're not a parent, but they have a lot
Yeah.
of exposure to young kids and that
Oh
experience.
yes.
And he got to this one moment in the narrative vignette, and he like leaned back very far in his chair, and he was like, yes, yes. And I was like, oh, what did you experience? And he was like, I know this feel so intimately. Like, and like,
Wow.
you've got like, and you've nailed it. Like I know exactly what you're saying. I felt
My
this feeling
gosh.
before. And that
Yeah.
as a designer, like, even talking about it, like kind of sends chills, right? It's like that as a
Yeah.
designer was like, oh, thank good. Like, this is great. Like I'm meeting that thing between like making sure that the execution of the gameplay is meeting
Yeah.
the execution of the game idea, right? Or the content or the story.
Mm.
Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, seeing that and then having that person like, yeah, really like, have it like, bring out all the feels, was just like
Yeah.
just super rewarding and super exciting.
Wow. Yeah, how incredibly fulfilling that must have felt. Yeah, because at the end of the day, like we're looking at a bunch of pixels dancing about on a screen.
Yeah.
And how is it this feeling of like the very mechanical nature of
Mm.
what you're making translate into this very emotional thing that manifests in someone leaning back in their chair and taking a deep sigh. Like, wow, that's really incredible. So
Yeah. Yeah.
what an amazing answer. That's beautiful. Well, do you have any tips you'd like to share for game devs to help balance that line between structure and creativity?
Build community, like find your people,
Yeah.
find the people that that seems like a little bit like search and destroy or something, like, don't like go and stalk them, but like, do that in like an organic, cool, fine way, right? Like,
Yeah.
but like, nurture the people that you want that you want to be talking to, and that whose perspective you value, and who are
Yeah.
wanting to support the thing that you're wanting to make, and
Hmm.
you know find them in a way that you feel like they'll be honest with you, and transparent
Mm.
with you, and supportive and encouraging.
Mm.
Because it's because there's a lot of screen time, right? There's a lot of time when you're like in the midst of making the thing and in your own head, and being able
Yeah.
to find people that you can then like really break out of the insularity, the bubble of like crafting an experience, I think is a
Yeah.
way to balance that, right? I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like so many of the best ideas that are in Bundle of Joy have come
Mm.
out of conversations that I've had with people about the design experience. They're not
Mhm.
like I'm in the shower and I'm like, Eureka! Like they're not like that amazing. It's
Yeah.
more like somebody says something in a conversation. I'm like, oh, that would be so good. Or I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's what I'm going for. Right. So
Yeah.
nurturing that community, finding that community, and trying to earnestly and sincerely, find a community, a group of individuals
Mm.
who you're wanting to like work with,
Mm-hmm.
is, I think, a really um, valuable way of like, finding that
Balancing.
balance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's such great advice, and at the end of the day, we're making this experience for other humans to play, and so
Mm,
it makes sense that you would be having this community of humans to
yeah,
help inform
totally.
this experience as well. So yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm gonna ask you a really big question,
Mm.
probably the biggest question. What is your favorite game?
Oh yeah. Oh, you led with this, and it's funny because I asked this question. I'm going to answer it. I promise. I
Okay,
asked this
okay.
question to my students as like an icebreaker too, and they're like
Yeah.
so quick to be like, "Oh, this like duh, blah." And then like inevitably, we go around the room, and I'm like, "Okay, cool. Like, well, it's really nice to meet all of you." Blah blah blah. And then inevitably, one of the students raised their hands and like, "Well, what's your favorite game?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." And I like hem and haw over it. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, I think like I've been thinking about this a lot, because I think like one way that you can measure this is like by hours played, right?
Sure, sure.
And like,
Yeah.
if that was the metric, then like Civilization 5 would definitely be my favorite game.
Okay.
But like,
Yeah.
now I don't play that game anymore, so it's like not
Yeah.
really in my rotation, and I think
Yeah.
I've really exhausted my, even though I played it for like so many hours, I think I've definitely like exhausted it as like being in my rotation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. So like favorite, and then there's like all these other things. Like I have a favorite nostalgia game. Like I really
Mm.
love Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo.
Oh,
I think it's
yeah.
just like such a wonderful piece of level design. The music
Mhm.
is so great. The
Yeah.
enemy design is like so fun. It's like so playful and silly, and
Yeah.
doesn't take itself too seriously, but it's also challenging. So it really strikes like a beautiful balance between something that's just really highly crafted, but
Mm-hmm.
also isn't so maniacal in its like presentation.
Yeah.
So that's definitely like up there for me too. And a lot of those like early Nintendo, Super Nintendo, like platformer games were like, yeah, definitely up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then like maybe a more recent game that I've been like really, yeah, that's like kind of been holding a special place for me. Um I guess like you could, yeah, I don't know. There's been like so much recently that I've been like super into.
Yeah.
And whether that's like Balatro, which I've like really loved, something that I can like pick up
Mm.
and put down as much as I
Yeah.
want. Um or yeah, something like Disco Elysium, which like the storytelling
Mm.
is just like, kind of unparalleled to a certain extent.
That
um
narrator.
yeah, yeah, it's just like
Yeah.
really well crafted, and
Yeah.
just the mechanics in it too are just like really well crafted, the game loop in it. um
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know, maybe that's like multiple answers.
There's definitely no there's a lot of great stuff in there, and I do think there's like those Nintendo games, there's something about them which is like looking at the pyramids in Egypt where it's just like, wow, it's perfect. you know just some sense of like, how did they how did they get it right,
Yeah,
like perfectly. you know?
I really think about that
Yeah.
with the Mario Galaxy games, like both one
Mm.
and two. As a designer, especially with level design,
Yeah.
they're just such master classes in
Sure.
thinking about how to teach the player to do something without actually teaching them how to do it. Just
Yes,
like
yes.
teaching by
Yeah.
learning, teaching by experimentation, teaching by
Mhm.
trial and error,
Mhm.
but still teaching through like fun and play. I find
Yeah.
them just incredible master classes of design.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And then again, like also, I'll give another shout out to like Kentucky Route Zero, because I think it is
Mm.
just like over the 5 acts and all of the different extra elements of that game, whether it's the telethon that they made or the short, kind of interactive play that was made, just like the overall experience of that project, I think is just so well crafted. It's so fascinating as a piece of writing and a piece of experience. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
so delicate in the way that it deals with really sensitive issues like debt and guilt and mortality and
Mm-hmm.
kinship. And yeah, I think it's just I think it's, and also visually I find it just so beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's just an incredible experience.
I might have to get the creators on this podcast because I've heard some very, very good things.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They're incredible. It's a
Yeah.
real. It's a. I find it like truly a masterpiece for sure.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to bring us to my last question of the podcast, which is my favorite one to ask people. So I've asked you to take your pick of either of the questions, which is one is organizing a party or getting to design a theme park. So I'd love to know your answer. Which of these and what is it about?
Yeah, between organizing a party in a theme park, is
Yeah.
that's what it is,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I'm like not a big. I'm not anymore. Not a big party person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I like definitely burn out on that in my Chicago years. And maybe the early years that I was like also in New York.
Yeah.
But stories for a separate podcast, maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'd say like a theme park. Yeah, theme park is like a really awesome premise.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd love to do a theme park that's like very like kind of structured, and I would love to do a theme park that's like almost like an escape the room, but it's not limited to a
Oh.
particular space, and it's about like discovery and secrets and like puzzles, like physical puzzles that are like in the space, but it's like much more spread out and dispersed and isn't about like conclusiveness, but is just kind of unraveling,
Yeah.
an experience. And then of course like rides that correspond to that. I think that would be
Yeah.
really interesting. Like, yeah, some kind of like mystery themed
Oh my
theme
gosh,
park.
that sounds great.
Yeah, I'm like a
Yeah.
big fan of like genre based fiction. So like something that like had a kind of like strong genre based theme, I think would be like really cool. So like yeah, some kind of like mystery noir type thing would be
Oh, I
really
would
fun.
love that. Yeah, I can totally imagine like sliding bookshelf
Yeah,
leading to a secret ride. That's very much the vibe I'm getting from it.
yeah, yeah, and like
Yeah.
maybe that would be an interesting thing. Like yeah, like you can only ride this thing if you've like collected certain information about something, or like I don't know,
Oh,
maybe that's a little too
very cool.
gatekeeping, but like yeah, I like the experience. I don't know, there's something about like early, or not early, but like local carny
Mhm.
things, like whatever, like festivals or fairs, where you like have
Yeah.
to get the tickets, like you have to buy the tickets before you like go to the ride. This is like a very popular thing in like whatever
Mm.
suburban America. And
Yeah.
so like to me, I'm like, oh, what if those tickets were like something that you didn't buy but you like gained in some way?
Oh,
Yeah,
wow. Now
so this,
that I would be
yeah,
into that.
is this like dangerously becoming close to like chorecraft? But yeah, but I still think like something where like the experience of going
Yeah.
had this kind of like immersive,
Hmm.
yeah, element that you could, gain information or gain knowledge, and that would unlock something in the
Yeah.
park.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I that sounds like my idea of a good time because I always think like, oh, I kind of want to go and check out like immersive theater,
Mm,
but then I listened to this one podcast by these two guys, Adam and Joe, who used to have this like really great podcast in the UK, and one of them talked about this experience of going to like this sort of like immersive like theater kind of experience, and like he went into a room and a woman was like touching his face, and she was like, "Oh my god, where is it?" I was like, "Nope."
Yeah.
Nope, I don't want to be involved in that way. But I do want to be involved in the sense that I'm like figuring out clues, trying to, find secrets. That sounds wonderful. So
Yeah.
I would absolutely get a ticket to your theme park, Nicholas.
Yeah.
Should you make it?
Yeah. Or like kind of along the same lines, like a giant theme park that's like a giant game of werewolf or something, right?
Oh my
Where like
gosh,
when you enter,
yes.
you like are given a role and it's like, okay, are you like are you like a bad guy or a good guy or something? And like a lot of the process is like finding out who's on what side or something. That would be
God, and the twists and the turns as well. You could throw in there.
And then there's
Yeah.
then there would be like, whatever, a central square or something where voting would happen in some way. That
Oh,
would be like
yeah.
super fun and
Totally.
funny. I don't know. I don't know how you could like really scale something like that, but it like
That
that would
sounds
be
great.
I think that would, if whoever could design that, I think that it would be really interesting.
Yeah, I'm just gonna put it out there into the universe. Somebody with like a lot of money, please get
Yeah,
that,
right.
because there's so many game devs I know that would be all about that.
100%.
Well, yes. Oh my gosh, my mind has just gone off on a spiral just thinking about it. But we're gonna have to end this podcast somewhere, and unfortunately, it's here. I thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like we got really into the weeds of talking about creativity, process, structure, and just it's just such a pleasure to hear your take on game dev and just creativity just in general. So
Thanks,
thank you
Naj.
so much. Thank you so much for joining me. So
Yeah,
where can
thank you
people
for
find
inviting
you?
me. Thank you.
Yeah.
People can find me on Blue Sky at SA Games. People can find me on Instagram at NO'Brien. And then if you search for Bundle of Joy on Steam, there's a Steam page for Bundle of Joy. And right at the top banner is the Discord link that's there, which I guess is like going to be going away at some point soon. So you can also find the Discord link on the side. And yeah, I'm in the Discord a lot. So yeah, those are all good places to find me.
All the places to find you. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you to all of you for watching our conversation. And yeah, if you guys have any questions for Nick, please reach out, because he's a wonderful resource. And yeah, here we go. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, Naj. Bye, everyone. Take care.